continue our reading from Luke chapter 18, directly from last week. So this is another story about prayer. Starting at verse 9. Jesus also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. Two men went up to the temple to pray. One, a Pharisee, the other, a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus: God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give a tenth of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted. The reading ends here. Let's see. My guess is that in this group, most of you remember a program called The Ed Sullivan Show. We do have some young folks. This was before there was cable TV. There were 3 or 4 stations, and everybody gathered around the TV on Sunday evening and watched a variety program called Ed Sullivan. There I was introduced to a lot of classic older comedians. My favorite of these was Rodney Dangerfield, who had one great tagline. Jack Benny himself told him, stick with that line and you'll make it in show business. Rodney Dangerfield would always say, I don't get no respect. I don't get no respect. Even when I was a kid, I got no respect. We went to the beach and I couldn't find my parents, and I went to the policeman and said, I can't find my parents. And he said, I don't know, kid, there's so many places where they could have hidden. I don't know if I'm right or wrong on this, but I'm going to use the idea of humility or being humbled as a way to connect seemingly very disparate readings this morning. The first from Joel. This is dealing with a people who have been humbled. These are people who know they are the chosen people of God, and they've gotten crushed underfoot, whether it's famine or whether it's metaphorical attack by an avenging army. We don't know, but they have been put down, or as Joel himself says, they have been put to shame. Are they supposed to stay like that? No. And instead, they are given a vision of a new and better future, or at the very least, a restored future. They are not to look at their own resources even, depleted, ruined, perhaps. But when the new day comes, they're told, the Spirit will fall on a multitude, not just on a prophet, not just on the priest, not just on a king, but the Spirit will touch everybody, not merely the chosen few. And I want to emphasize this morning, the young and old alike. Few things will humble the most braggadocious person is growing older, where things that you took for granted slip away, and you have to think about how you're going to get out of bed. and you're afraid to climb on the little step stool to reach something from the top shelf in case you'll fall. Aging is one limitation after another, it seems. It is a humbling experience, whether you're already humble or not. It shows your limitations. Joel wants to use rain as an example, that God's Spirit will fall on young and old, rich and poor alike. The idea is God will shower the Spirit on us. And Joel is careful to give both physical and spiritual blessings to everybody as a sign of a new and better future. He goes further, dangerously so. God will not bless only the people of the little city-state of Judah around Jerusalem. It will be on all flesh, not just even human flesh, it seems. All living things will be restored, will rise up from the destruction that they've seen. A few weeks ago, we were one of the sites for the architecture tour for the Alton Landmarks Association. On that window, you will see, third from the front, you will see something that I do not believe is in any other Presbyterian church as a sign of Easter. A phoenix. The mythical bird that rises from the ashes, and only from the ashes does it live. That obviously fit this congregation after the fire almost 30 years ago. But that's a resurrection symbol too. From out of ashes can come new life and a new future. Such a vision moves us from an image of being miserly about gifts to generous. End-time images in our time are usually thought to be images of doom, but they are always in the Bible also visions of a better future and restoration. They rarely, if ever, consist of punishment alone. This image of Joel gets picked up by Luke to describe Pentecost, the giving of the Spirit to those gathered in the upper room, but it goes far beyond that experience. This vision was inclusive on gender and on age. The enlivening gift of the Spirit touches all people, no matter how they're born or no matter their age. It's an antidote to aging's questions. Why am I here? What purpose do I serve at this age of my life? Looking back, what did I accomplish? It opens the door to a future, even in age. What is in store for me? Now, Joel promises a better future someday. But what do we do in the meantime? Our epistle from 2 Timothy is for people who will not yet see Christ return, even as they were expecting Joel's vision to be in their midst in their lifetime. And the writer here in our reading are the ending verses of what sound to me like an old man. Neil Young, himself now old, wrote, "It is better to burn out than it is to rust." He has a good image, I think, of aging. It's better to live fully, no matter our age. Yesterday, we selected this very passage as the New Testament reading for the service for Grace Summers. When she told me about her diagnosis and that the attempted cure would be worse than the disease, she looked back at her long life and she was honestly able to say that she had few regrets. Her words and Paul's words are encouragement to the lonely and defeated soul, a young soul or an old soul. We're promised that God's power and presence will be with us at all times and within us, and that God uses us to work redemption and victory through our obviously limited capacities. God empowers us to live the Christian life, both in good times and bad. We embody God's Spirit. We are empowered by God's Spirit. Paul writes here a valedictory for old age. He looks back at his past and says, there was no one there to support me. How often in hard times we feel alone, unsupported, unhelped, unrecognized. But he says, God was with me and gave me strength. He realizes that no matter his age, he is a conduit of God's work. How did I make it to this point, he asks. God has a purpose for me even at this age. Yes, to continue to be God's message, and indeed, God's messenger. I'm so struck by that initial image that Paul chooses, and I'm not sure what he's referring to for certain. He says, my life is being poured out like a libation, a drink offering. If he was referring to the way you ended a dinner party in those days, it was the signal that things had ended, and that you poured the last cup, as it were, to the gods. The time had come for an end. The same word got used for in a variety of reasons. It was time for a ship to set sail. It was a sign of conclusion or completion. Or maybe he was referring to something we rarely think about in church. It was one of the Hebrew sacrifices at the temple. That there were animal sacrifices in the temple precincts. Everybody knows that. But there were a variety of other offerings of fruits and vegetables. And many of the sacrifices were concluded or completed with this drink offering being poured out. I was struggling with it, and I wrote Clinton McCann, the great psalm scholar over at Eden Seminary, and he said, I don't know what this is about either. I've always read it to mean that God deserves a full meal. But what he meant was it was a sign of completion, if you will, from appetizer to dessert. To pour out one's life like a drink offering means less that my life's been wasted, if that's even what he means at all, or that it's poured out to the last drop, but that now my life is coming to its closure, its fitting end, the last act that brings it all together. But hear it. It is thoroughly possible that Paul is seeing his life's end as his last, final offering to God, just as his whole life's work, every breath, is an offering to the God who gives us life. For us, then, it's a sacramental image that something ordinary has become sacred and transformed into enacted prayer. We all use the gifts of God, but they're changed or transformed by our action as well. It's a unity as in Jesus, of the divine and the human. Paul is using an ancient image of communion with God that included food and drink. Sacrifice itself, as with prayer, is an act of humility. I close then where we all are, in this place of prayer. Jesus has a Pharisee, someone who struggled to live as good a life as a human being could, at prayer. And I can't tell if standing off by himself was in a position where he could be seen, or was he up front, or was he in a humble prayer posture? I can't tell. That he's not with others could be read either way. The tax collector, we can be clear on. This was a Roman collaborator, someone who was getting the people's money and giving it to the Roman oppressors. And they were also thought to be, every one of them, cheats. And that they had grown rich at the expense of their own people. And at the same time, skimming off the Romans. They are utter scoundrels in other reasons. They're both at prayer. Prayer itself, as I said, is a humble posture. I don't run the world. I am dependent on you, dear God. Jesus says, however, that the miscreant goes home rectified, justified, in proper relation with God. Imagine telling the Pharisee that. They were both doing the righteous act of prayer. But in so doing, we're touched by the example of humility and hubris in the story. And I caught this maybe for the first time ever. I know what the Pharisee said, and I've always heard it as religious bragging. That basically, I always heard the prayer like this: "Oh God, aren't you lucky to have me? Oh God, I bet you wish you had more people like me. Aren't you lucky?" This time I heard it differently. He's comparing himself, isn't he? And the very act of comparison is often a dangerous tool. I fall into this trap all the time. I compare different religious expressions with Christianity, and I often find the other expressions wanting or less. It's a difficult thing to try to do religious comparisons and stay objective. I fall into this trap all the time when I compare being Presbyterian with other expressions of the Christian faith. Guess who always wins? Or even when we have our own internal struggles, when we compare, my side is the right side, the other side is less. This goes beyond religion. Listen to liberals compare themselves to conservatives. It's unbearable. Listen to conservatives compare themselves to liberals. It's unbearable. And it's always from the same posture. I'm up here, they're down there. Oh God, aren't you lucky to have me as opposed to them? It's so dispiriting. It's a game of I'm superior to you. Further, the Pharisee's attention really is diverted from his prayer to God because he's observing the publican, the tax collector. When you think about it, comparison rarely invites humility, unless you're a person of enormous ego strength. When we compare ourselves to another, we make a division. Or we fall into the opposite camp, as I told the children. Keeping up with the Joneses is the form of negative comparison we often make. But notice it's almost always about material things and not spiritual, mental, or emotional things. If we continue to divide each other up into opposing camps, we fall into the trap of the Pharisees' prayer. But Jesus tells a story where two utterly different people are enfolded in God's presence in what they thought was the very portal to the divine life, the temple. And from Joel and from the letter to Timothy, we're reminded of this. No matter who we are, God enfolds us within the divine life, young or old, humble or proud, self-righteous or not. In a time where we are so determined to emphasize the differences between us, it's a good corrective to remind us that God looks through all those, in the end, minor differences, and instead insists that God sees us as God's own.